Hi, my name is Riley Hansen,
My name is Hwan Kim.
And I'm Tim Blake.
and for our Gapminder project, we're going to look at total GDP in a country and cumulative CO2 emissions in a country. So here we go.
GDP and CO2 are rising at the same time, so if you were just looking at the indicators, you could think that because economic growth is increasing, an increase in CO2 emissions is good as well. But this is not the case. CO2 is greenhouse gas that gets trapped in the ozone layer of our atmosphere and will eventually cause the ozone layer to burn up if carbon emission grows at this pace.
The three countries that we will be looking more in depth into for our project are China, Japan, and the United States. And the time periods are going to start. We're going to start at 1970 and look at up until the data in the at in the graph at 2011 until the data ends. And in that time period, we're going to be splitting up into the different. We're going to be organizing our data from the different environmental policies that those countries went through over that time period and looking at the effects that they had on CO2 emissions and GDP.
The United States was one of the pioneers of regulation of CO2 emissions, with the development of the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, which controls and regulates the laws regarding pollution, and more specifically in our case, CO2 emission. First, looking at the years of 1970 to 1994, with the start of the EPA until Tier 1 emission standards of Phase 1 that was enacted in the United States. A 73.9% increase in overall CO2 emissions and an annual increase of 3.7 over that time period of 24 years. After the adaptation of the Tier 1 emission standards in the United States between the years 1994 and 2004, there was a 21% increase in overall CO2 emissions and a 21% average annual increase in CO2 emissions between those 10 years. Finally, the Phase 2 standards that became imposed in 2005, which were stricter regulations on the amount of CO2 that was allowed to be emitted until 2009, where Obama announced a new national fuel economy and emission policy. We can see an 8.7% increase in overall emissions and a 1.74 annual average increase between those 5 years. So, based on this information, we can see that through the inductions of new emission laws, the overall emissions increased, but at a decreasing rate. On the other hand, China did not impose regulation of emissions until the year 2000, but similarly changed its policy 3 times in accordance with the Euro standard of emissions. Based on the information and data that China has, it also increased, but at a decreasing annual rate. While both the United States and China's emissions were increasing at a decreasing rate, both countries' GDP continued to grow.
When looking at Japan, they can be looked at as a more ideal growth model in terms of the two indicators. Japan is second in the world in GDP by 2011 and has the same CO2 emissions as France, India, and Russia, despite having 3 times the total yearly GDP.
Therefore, we can say that it is false correlation between two indicators. The US and China were able to decrease yearly CO2 output while continuing to increase yearly GDP.